So, hey everyone, as we all know now, my name's Rebecca. So, right now I work in strategy at Salesforce, where I've been for over a year. Previously, I spent 3 years in consulting. So, first I was at Strategy and was part of PwC. I was located in Chicago, where I worked on projects in healthcare and technology and traveled to a lot of different parts of the States. And then after that, I spent time in a boutique consulting firm in Boston. So, basically the opposite. It was like a 20, 30 people firm working on growth strategy and go-to-market projects across education. So I did things like helping special education schools increase their enrollment, working with publishers to bring to work on their like English and language arts offerings, and helping the Gates Foundation look at like digital like products to help students pass introductory courses. So doing a lot of work across like healthcare, technology, and education. And then at these firms, I had a lot of experience with recruiting. So while I was at Strategian, I led recruiting for Northwestern. And so I went to a lot of like led info sessions, did a lot of copy chats, help people prepare for their final round interviews. And then at the boutique firm, I was also part of the recruiting team. So in addition, I did a lot of like resume screening, also went to schools to give info sessions, also helped develop different like analytical exercises that we use for interviews, and also interviewed candidates. So have a breadth of experience both across consulting and strategy at Salesforce, and also being in a recruiting team. And then lastly, I studied economics and Asian studies and managerial analytics while I was at Northwestern. So it's a little bit about me and my background. Tim, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim. So I did my undergrad at Caltech, and I studied electrical engineering. After I graduated, I worked at BCG as an associate. I was working out of the Seattle office and spent my time kind of flying up and down the West Coast on a couple of different projects, mostly focused on tech firms. So I was helping with product management at a semiconductor firm, helping them release a new product. I was also working at a hardware networking company on their working with their sales team on the sales incentives. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Since leaving BCG, I was working on my master's in electrical engineering, which I actually just finished up about 2 weeks ago. And so I'll be working at a drone startup as a software engineer afterwards. Thanks.
Okay, so before we begin, I just want to say that we are very flexible. We're also pretty casual, and we want this session to be pretty interactive. So if you guys ever have questions, feel free to like raise the little hand emoji, or feel free to like type stuff into the chat. We'll try and monitor it. If we are like going too quickly, I know I talk kind of fast sometimes, so if we're going too quickly, definitely just like tell us to slow down. We really do want this to be like very helpful for everyone. So don't be shy about asking questions. I know definitely like a case is not very intuitive, and so when it starts out, if it's like your first time hearing it, even if it's like you've heard it once or twice before, I feel like it's still not very intuitive. So definitely just feel free to ask questions is the point we're trying to get across. So I'm going to start off by talking about what a case interview is and some like best practices that we have, and then we want this session to be very interactive. And so Tim is actually going to walk everyone through a practice case, and we're going to like take turns answering different parts of it. So we're going to get very familiar with one another, hopefully. So what is a case interview? So a case interview usually lasts around 30 or 45 minutes, and it simulates a type of case or project work that a consulting firm does. So case interviews are most frequently talked about during the consulting interview process, but I think it's important to know that cases also happen during a lot of other types of interviews. So like last year when I was transitioning out of consulting and I wanted to work in some sort of like strategy or business operations role at a tech company or at an ed tech startup, I also did a lot of cases, even though they were for like industry jobs. So cases are talked about the most for consulting, but they're also done for a lot of other jobs as well. So that's why they're important. So usually during a case, the interviewer might present, usually during a project, the interviewer would present about a client that has a goal or a problem that needs to be solved. And so your interviewer might have a question for you like, okay, you have this client, like a pretty simple example is like you have a client and they want to grow their revenue somehow, and then you would have to brainstorm with the interviewer, like how do they grow their revenue. So in this example, the candidate or the interviewee would develop some sort of recommendation for the client based on information that the interviewer provides. So a lot of times this is also based on the actual cases that interviewers have worked on. So some companies have like very, very structured cases in which they have a lot of like diagrams for you, a lot of information for you. And we're going to go through something that's pretty structured like that, but then some other interviewers. So I think, so Tim worked at BCG, as he mentioned, and BCG has like pretty structured cases where they present you a lot of information versus when I was interviewing at StrategyN, a lot of the stuff was more free flowing. So one of the cases I had at StrategyN was basically that there was this dying newspaper business, and my job as the interviewee was thinking of ways to turn around this newspaper business, and there wasn't really that much information. So it could be really really structured with a lot of information, or you might have to rely a lot on your like creativity and just like thinking on the spot. So along those lines, some of the different skills that are evaluated during a case interview are, of course, your communication speaking, because you're basically walking the interviewer through your thought process of how you would solve this actual case or this actual problem. A lot of times there will be math and data analysis involved, especially if the interviewer has a lot of charts or graphs or slides that you need to look at and present to the interviewer, as well as a lot of like math if you're trying to figure out maybe the profitability of something or the market size. There's a lot of like mental math that needs to be done. There's a lot of problem solving in different business contexts, because that is the whole nature of the case, to think about if you're given this business problem, how would you navigate it? And then finally, it's important to have an understanding of how companies operate, because at least for me, like I was an economics major at Northwestern, which wasn't super like practical, and that we didn't really talk about different companies and how companies actually worked, but that is a really important skill. So at least for me, when I was preparing for a lot of case interviews, I would read maybe like Wall Street Journal or The Economist, just different news articles, or fellow econ major, or just like a lot of other real world stories, basically about how companies operated, because for me at least, that's what I felt I needed to bridge like what I was learning in school and what was actually happening in the quote unquote the real world. So that's an overview of a case. Are there any questions so far? Okay. Maybe we can go to the next slide then. Okay, so here we've tried to lay out a few different components of the case that you'll go through basically as you're going through this interview. So initially, there's the case introduction, where your interviewer will present you with the actual problem. It could be something really simple, like what I said about how do we turn around this dying newspaper business, or it might be a little bit more complicated, but it's usually for the most part a few sentences. And then after the interviewer does this, it's on you to summarize the case for the interviewer, ask any clarifying questions that you might have, as well as this gives you some time to get organized after you hear the very beginning of the case. After that, you'll have to build a framework, or a framework is really just like a way that you would organize your thoughts. So as we say, organize, 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 or create some kind of like tree of things that you might want to look at, or important questions that you might want to ask. So for instance, I know like common frameworks that people rely on, or common categories that people would look at, are things like customer or company, market, competitors. When you're building your framework, you would basically think of like maybe what are the like 3 or 4 main categories of things that you want to look at that are like broad enough, that gives you a lot of flexibility to explore like what you need to know about a case. So then after that, as we mentioned, sometimes there are graphs during these cases. So we call this walk the perimeter, but basically you have to present this graph to the interviewer. He'll show you a graph, and then you have to show him like what you've taken away from the graph. And so walking the perimeter just means making sure you call out like the title, what are the axis labels, maybe what are the units, just to help like contextualize what is happening in the graph. And then it's really important to think about the implications of the graph when you are and how that ties back to your case instead of just like reciting what the graph is. If you're ever unsure about the data, make sure you ask about it. I know sometimes, especially if the graph is kind of complicated, maybe you want to seem like you know what you're doing. And so I think it's easy and natural to like maybe not ask questions if you're unsure about things, but then if you go through the rest of the case, you're kind of setting yourself up a little on a rocky footing. So definitely like make sure to ask questions if you're unsure about the data, because it's gonna really help you. And then as you go through the case at the very end, you'll have to come up with a conclusion and a recommendation for what the client should do in this business problem. So it's really important to give a recommendation. It's similar to like presenting implications on a graph instead of just like wrapping up. You don't have to rehash like the entire case and every single thing you did, but usually we'll say that you would like summarize the case in a sentence and then give like and your recommendation, and then maybe give like 3 supporting reasons why you believe in that recommendation, and then maybe any like next steps or risks or things you want to look into. But overall, for your conclusion, make sure you're really succinct, but also really clear. So I know all of this, and I feel like the last slide, especially if you're not familiar with cases, this might have been a lot, or it might sound kind of like abstract and theoretical, which is why we're going to very shortly walk through an actual case so you guys can put a lot of these into practice. But I think before we move on, does anyone have any like questions, or is anything unclear?
Yeah, it looks like we have
Okay, it
a.
looks like
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask Koa Tran to unmute. So you should see something pop up on your screen.
Yeah, I see it. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right,
Yeah.
perfect. Hi, my name is Qual Tran. I'm currently a third year UC Irvine, but thanks for setting this up. I guess my question is, when you're coming up with a conclusion recommendation, you're presenting it to the person that's interviewing you, and you can kind of read their facial their reaction that is not right. What do you do in that situation? Do you start backtracking, or do you continue on and reason your way out of it?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think like what I would do. I guess it depends. It's hard to like react on the spot, so I'm like not sure. I think like I think it depends like how far along I would be in giving my conclusion. Because if I'm about to finish it, I would just keep giving it, or like maybe I would like, if I could think of a smart way to do it, I would probably like want to like ask or see like say something to the interviewer like, oh, it looks like maybe there's a different direction you would want to go in, or try and say something to like clarify it, because I think, or I would try and like look and see if there's any like glaring mistakes, because yeah, it's definitely not like an ideal situation to be in. So I think I'm like a little thinking like both ways, because on one hand I'm like, okay, I think this says a lot. I think if you're confident and you really think you have like good reasons, you should keep going, because like cases don't always have like a definitive answer unless it's like a quantitative case where there's a very specific number. But like a lot of times maybe the interviewer doesn't agree with you initially, but maybe they can be persuaded. So I think especially if it's more qualitative, especially if you're really confident in your answer, I think it depends on that. Versus I think it's also though important during cases to like kind of read the interviewer's face, because if they're nice, especially, they will try and like guide you during the case. So I guess I would say it depends like how confident you are in your answer, and if there is like some sort of like smart way for you to kind of like communicate with your interviewer and see like, oh, maybe there are like other directions they want to go in. I think that's helpful too, because at the end of the day, like working on these cases, like yes, as the interviewee, you are the one like driving forward the case, and you should be, but you are also like working together with your interviewer, because it is also like trying to simulate it's trying to simulate like this work environment where you guys would be like going off of each other to come to an answer. So I don't know if that was a really concrete answer, but I think that's how I would approach it. Tim, do you have any additional thoughts for how you would approach that?
I'll just chip in that, as we will soon see, there often isn't a single right answer, and you can be wrong in a very interesting way. And if you can defend it, that's just as valuable as if you had, gone the right answer.
Yeah, I think also not all interviewers would do this, but I think sometimes people might like prod a little or like ask you questions just to see like how confident you are in it as well, in your answer.
All right, thanks for asking that question. I'm gonna go ahead and call on Camille next.
So my question is, when you're concluding your answer to your interviewer, how do you best wrap it up in a short amount of time, given that you've written like little details about, small recommendations about the like company? Do you have any tips for concluding well and fast?
A fantastic question. And we will do an example of this, and hopefully the example will be very informative. I think the big things to keep in mind is imagine you're talking to the CEO of the company, and Madam CEO is very busy being the CEO of the company. And so you don't need to talk about, oh, I did this analysis, I added these two numbers, or I looked at this graph and it was blue on this axis and pink on the other one. Like, that's not important. The important thing that you need to talk about is, what is your recommendation? What does the company need to do to solve the problem that you set out to solve? So I guess one way to anchor it is think about, what was the original question? We're trying to raise profits. We're trying to reduce attrition. And if what you're saying doesn't answer that question, then you might need to refocus a little bit. So I think the example will hopefully clear things up, but thank you for asking, because a lot of people, including myself, struggle with the conclusion.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, maybe like tactically, as you're going through it, for me, it's helpful to like the scratch paper you have. It's helpful to like maybe like draw a physical box around the points that you think are like really important. So then when you like look back on it, you can see like, oh, I drew like these 3 boxes. I think also, whenever you're going through the case, if there are numbers, those are usually pretty important. So if there's like profitability or a market size or like a profit margin, like those numbers are usually pretty important to be like at least one of your 3 reasons during your conclusion. So I would definitely like draw a box around those and make sure to bring those up during the conclusion.
All right, thanks for asking that question, Camille. I think we have time for one more question, but just before that, I'm going to drop in some information for you all to stay connected with. Firstly, feel free to join our Slack community, follow our Instagram, and also check out our website. If you had a question but didn't get time to answer, we're going to try to allocate some time towards the end of the presentation for you to ask. So just kind of hold on to those questions or put them in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Vincent now. Feel free to ask your question, Vincent.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it, man. Yeah, my question was regarding walking the perimeter. I understand a lot, like what Rebecca was saying earlier. It's about like explain what you see on the axis, like explain what you see on these numbers. Can you share what the importance of doing that is? I feel that a lot of times it feels as in like, oh, this we know that x-axis says this, we know the y-axis says this, but yeah, every time I listen to these cases, people say like they stress the importance of doing that.
Yeah,
So,
I think at least for, oh, sorry.
oh, go ahead, take it away.
Yeah, I was gonna say, at least for me, I think especially when you're in like an interview situation, and like I definitely get kind of nervous during interviews, and if it's like kind of high pressure, I think it's kind of easy to like lose yourself and you see a graph, and I'm probably going to like internally freak out a little bit and like get lost and get ahead of myself. So I think like walking the perimeter serves a few different functions. So I think like one, it helps me like make sure I'm really understanding what's happening. It kind of helps me like be grounded into it so that I like even know what I'm looking at, because I think you can understand like trends, and it's really easy to like get ahead of yourself and kind of be like, oh, I think I know this is talking about, but you just want to like make sure, especially when you're like a little bit nervous, like make sure you are looking at the right things. So I think like one, that's kind of like for yourself. I think two, it's also helpful just to like be on the same page as your interviewer, to make sure you are reading the axes and these different things correctly. And I think third, it's also important to like, I guess like make sure that if you see a graph and you see like if it's like going up or something exponentially, it's easy to like assume you know what it's talking about, but maybe like you're looking at it differently than your interviewer. So I guess it's kind of like rehashing what I said in both parts, just like make sure you are interpreting it correctly, like not just like the trend line or whatever that's happening, but also like the actual context, and then just making sure you're on the same page as your interviewer, especially in these like kind of nerve-wracking situations. Tim, did you have anything to add?
So my only point would be that when you're presenting with the graph, your goals are to make sure that you understand the graph and to communicate to the interviewer what the important points of the graph are. And starting off with what is the graph actually about is a really good way to start off. And then you look at, the inside, what are the patterns? And again, I think the examples that we should do will hopefully make things a little bit more clear.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so it looks like we don't have any more questions for now. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off into the group practice case, which I will be running. And so the way that this will work is that I will pretend to be the interviewer, and then you will all collectively, be the candidate. And so we'll walk through this case. There'll be a little bit more start and stop, and I'll provide a little bit more information than if this was like an actual interview. And so for each of the portions, like the introduction or when we see graphs, I'm going to ask people to bravely unmute themselves and give a kind of like sample answer. I think the best way for this might be just to use the raise hand feature that people have been using, and maybe Kevin can choose someone to unmute each time, and I might have a couple of people give it a go. I can't emphasize this enough, but please speak up and give it a try. I went to a case workshop kind of like this in person when I was interviewing, and the consultants running it, they asked like, how would you get started? And I raised my hand and I said something that was completely wrong and made a fool of myself. But I learned so much more by making that mistake than I would if I had like sat in the corner and said nothing. And that workshop was with BCG, which is where I ended up working. So please, even if you don't know, and especially if you are unsure, raise your hand and give it a try. Any questions about like the format of this or how it'll work? I'm going to try to shoot for finishing about 10 till the top of the hour. So we might not get through all of it, but we'll just try to get through what we can then. Okay, so I'll kick us off. So let me just rearrange my screen a little bit. So the case is called the Drusselstein Electrification Initiative. And so here's kind of the introduction to the case. Drusselstein is a largely rural developing country. The government is putting together a proposal to electrify their country because they want to grow the economy and make people's lives better. So the government will be presenting its proposal to the World Bank, which is considering funding the project. And so the World Bank has asked the government of Drusselstein to address some of the points in its proposal. And the big points being the cost effectiveness, environmental impact, and local buy-in and support of their electrification case. So you, the candidate, have been brought on by the Drusselstein government to help them put together this proposal. And so our kind of big question will be, what factors should a Drusselstein government consider as it puts together this proposal? So kind of a normal start to a case would be just to really quickly summarize it back to the interviewer to make sure that you understand it. Does anyone want to give this a shot?
Yeah, so looking at this case here, we see that we're looking at a country called Drusselstein. They're a largely rural and still developing country. So they're looking to develop some sort of electricity grid for the purposes of improving their economy and improving the quality of life for the citizens. The government wants to figure out how to get money and figure out how to propose for this. So they're looking at the World Bank, and the World Bank is specifically asking for Drusselstein for 3 key points. And those are, I just want to confirm, they're the cost effectiveness, environmental impact, and local buying support. So our project here, our project here today is to figure out what are the factors that the Drusselstein government should use for this proposal.
Okay, fantastic. That was a great introduction. So another part that you would do at the start of the case would be to ask any clarifying questions. So how about for this one, everyone put in the chat, if you can think of one clarifying question that you might ask the interviewer, or if everything seems clear, why don't you answer the question at the bottom? What are some factors you think that the Drusselstein government should consider as it puts together this proposal? So why have everyone try to think of at least one thing they can put in the chat, either a clarifying question or the question at the bottom of the screen. Okay, these seem some good ones. Right, so we definitely want to understand how we receive power right now. Are there any other objectives that we should know about? That's usually good to ask if there's additional ones. Things like the population, timeline of the project. So I see a couple of these things, like the details of like, would there be a loan? How dense are the cities? And things like that. These are really important factors. And these are factors that you probably wouldn't ask at the front of a case, but as you go along and it becomes important, then you would ask. So the start of the case, we would focus on like are there any objectives that I'm not clear about? And then later on, we get into these wonderful details that people have said, like the cost of electricity, the density of the cities, the loan rates, all those are great details, but probably more appropriate for kind of later on down the case. But thank you so much for putting those into the chat. Okay. So we kind of just did this. What are some factors that Drusselstein government should consider in its proposal? And you guys listed a lot of really great ones, like the quantity of electricity, negative externalities, really great. Okay, so these are just a couple of different samples to the things that maybe people would just kind of consider. And if you were actually sitting in this case, I think these are kind of ideas that you might want like in your head or maybe jotting down the piece of paper. And so things like the types of resources, the cost of resources, environmental impact, and whatnot. So it's kind of this case is a little bit more, there is some structure to it, but you also do kind of have to think about these other factors. So here is just a little bit more additional information. Normally what will happen is the interviewer will have a little bit of like, extra information that they have from their provided materials. And as you, the candidate, are going through the case, you might, if you ask them, they might have the right answer. They might have these answers to your questions. But this is kind of information that could come up, but may not be like absolutely necessary. So in this part of the case, we're going to do another brainstorming. What are some energy resources that we should consider? And what are some costs of electricity, both in terms of fixed and variable costs? And so a lot of times the interviewer will ask these kind of brainstorming questions. So again, why don't we put in the chat, what are some energy resources that we should consider? And what are some costs of electricity, both fixed and variable? All right, these are some really good things to consider. We could consider solar or wind or nuclear, other things. Some of the costs might be, okay, we're thinking about the local economic impact. Nuclear waste could be a concern. Okay, great. So does anyone want to give it a shot, unmute themselves and kind of present to the interviewer? If I asked you, what are some energy resources and what are some costs, what would you say?
Yeah, I could try.
Sure, go for it.
I feel like I would first ask, what are the available infrastructure available in Drusselstein already? And based on the available infrastructure to optimize the energy or optimize the resource to make the most energy I would look at the top 3 resources that would be optimized based on the infrastructure available, because we're trying to reduce the costs of, and that goes into the next part of the question. It goes into reducing the costs of building more infrastructure to do this. And then variable costs, the costs of running it.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. I think there's something that I really, really loved, which is that you said, I would want to know about the costs of the different resources available. And one of the parts of the case is that's really important is that some companies will want the candidate to be driving the case and be asking questions just like that. So if I was doing this case and I saw this prompt from the interviewer, I'd say, well, I think we should probably consider things like wind and solar and coal, but importantly, I want to know what are the resources that are already available for this country. Do we have any information about what types of energy resources are available? And just as you asked that's a really good way to show that you are trying to give direction to the case and taking the initiative. So really glad that you brought that up. Does anyone else want to take a stab at this? How would they respond to this prompt?
In terms of the second part of the question for costs of electrification, I keep thinking about the amount of land that it would take up, the equipment, as well as if they're doing nuclear, they'd have to construct a power plant, and that would require a lot of energy and space. So I'd also like to ask about that, but it may be a little bit too specific. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. And yeah, you really hit the key points of, here's kind of my first hypothesis. We could do nuclear, we could do coal or whatever else. But you're also saying, well, if we go down these different branches, these are the other things that you would probably have to consider, like where you're going to put the waste or how will we build the plant. So really great job answering this, guys. So this is just a couple of sample answers. This is just like a list of different resources. And here are a couple of other things that we might have to consider, like capital costs, ongoing maintenance, acquiring land, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so Drusselstein has assessed its resources and they've produced a couple of charts, which I'll soon show. And the charts illustrate the abundance of each energy resource throughout the country. And we'll see that they're colored based on how expensive the electricity from each source is in specific region. And so the things I want you guys to kind of think about is, what conclusions can you draw from these charts? And here we just see a couple of additional information about how long coal and wood will last, and that wind is going to be very variable. So we're going to need batteries as well. So I'm going to present some charts. Okay, one sec. I think it's skipped. Okay, here we go. Here's a chart. So everyone take 30 seconds, kind of digest this chart. And when you guys are ready, someone please raise your hand and give it a shot. What would you say to analyze this chart? Actually, right now, I want everyone to kind of put one thing in the chat, something that they notice about the chart or a question that they have about the chart. Hexagons. What are the hexagons? That's a great question. So the hexagons are just like you can think of them as like kind of counties, or just like a crude way of like breaking up the chart. That's all they really represent, just like a piece of area. That's a great observation. The cost of wind can range depending on where it is. Wood is the cheapest. That's a good observation. Is solar an option? That's another good question to ask. I would kind of assume that if it's not on the chart, it probably isn't an option, but that's definitely a good thing to ask the interviewer. Okay, I'm seeing some really good analyses too. Wood is overall the cheapest, but we're going to cut down all the forests in 20 years. So maybe that's not the greatest idea. Yeah, again, these are some really great kind of summaries. Would anyone like to unmute themselves and explain the chart to the interviewer? If you're feeling hesitant, oh, we have somebody.
Yeah, so from these charts, I can see that wind varies the most. However, the edges it seems most viable, while coal, which is I think longer lasting compared to wood, seems to be the cheapest. While wood is the cheapest, but like I said before, an additional fact that it lasts the shortest. So I think I move away from that and see that coal is not that much more expensive, but can last, I believe, said 50 years, so more than double.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. We have one more person. I'm gonna have you unmute.
I guess I would have said the same thing, but yeah, it looks like wind is most expensive in the middle of the country, but might be a viable option at the periphery on the east and west. Like you said, coal and wood are both relatively cheap across the country, but they also have pretty finite timelines for their use. Assuming that with wood, you're not like, you don't have some plan in place to like replant them, which I don't think at like consumption rates, especially as they develop, would be sustainable anyways.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. So, and I see Deanna, you have your hand raised. I'll get to you in just a moment. And so, yeah, I think kind of the most important points, just to rehash, are that there's considerable variation in the cost of each energy resource throughout the country. Coal and wind are the cheapest, as y'all said. But with coal and wind, there are some challenges or potential problems with how sustainable those are. And I see Deanna has a hand raised as well.
Yeah. Do you think it would be important to also mention that with wood and coal, like burning wood is unsustainable also for the environment, and same with the dangers of like using coal as a power source?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic to add in. So kind of the things, it's always great when you can kind of bring in outside information, because I think a good candidate would be able to analyze this chart and say, this is what I see, coal and wind are cheap and wind is expensive. But I think what sets a kind of a stronger candidate apart would be saying, like, being able to bring in this information that coal and wind are cheaper, but there might be negative externalities. We might have to be concerned about pollution or health problems. So maybe these aren't as attractive as we think they are. And so you're both analyzing the graph, but also pulling out kind of what's important. So I see a couple other questions, which is fantastic. So I'm going to ask you on mute as well.
Hi, Timothy. I had a question. Maybe my answer will be too long-winded, no pun intended. But should we talk or discuss about the colors as well? Like, for example, like taking a look at this chart, I see that green is the cheapest color, and as we go up the color spectrum up to red is the most expensive at $2,000. Or is that too much information that we should leave out from our analysis?
I think that's probably not necessary to include, because it's kind of like saying like the left side of the axis is the lowest and that right side is the highest. Like, it's probably not necessary to include. But thank you so much thank you for asking that. And then we have one more hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so assuming that this is like the last chart that we were going to see on it, would it be appropriate to ask, like, okay, you're showing me like domestic capability, but are we not looking at like importing? And also, it seems like it'd be a good time, like this is what you could viably like mine or like harvest domestically. But so I think we're looking at like short term, we probably want like coal or something that's going to be heavy pollutant, but showing World Bank that we want to kind of wean off of that or have a mix that goes more towards sustainable resources in the long run, considering like how rural and like developing this country still is. Would that be like appropriate at that time?
Yeah, I think both would be appropriate to bring up. I think you could phrase it as, so these are domestic sources. Are we, do we have information on potentially importing energy? I kind of skipped through this earlier on, but there was a point earlier that Drusselstein doesn't want to be dependent on its neighbors, but I did kind of brush that really quickly. And for your second point about could we construct like a long range vision of, we start burning wood and then we switch to wind in the long term? I think that is something that you could kind of bring into as like a suggestion, demonstrate that you're thinking about these things. So yeah. Okay. So again, we kind of hit most of the big ones. Wind's only feasible in some parts, coal and wind are the cheapest. And maybe we want to do some kind of a mix. Sorry, my screen's is, I think, lagging just a little bit. Okay, so I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I think we're gonna kind of skip through this part a little bit. This is kind of like a typical math problem that you will see. So you can kind of look at this and try to solve this offline if you wanted to, where we might be presented with a table or a chart showing like how much, well, here this is showing the cost per kilowatt and then what the funding plan would look like. And so I would encourage people to kind of look at this offline and try to solve it. And usually you won't be given a calculator, so try to do this without a calculator the first time through. So in our remaining time, I'm going to try to do 2 more portions of the case. So the government has gone out and collected some public comments from people living across the country. And they're given the following information that the government is trying to electrify the country, and we're playing several sources. And so we're going to see some of the responses from the people that the government went out and surveyed. And they were asked these 2 questions. And so what I want people to think about when they see the survey results are what are the important points and how would you summarize this to the interviewer? So here are the answers to here are some public comments about the electrification plan. So in the chat, go ahead. What are some like big important points that you see, and like kind of try to summarize these points? Okay, I see someone has their hand up, so I'll ask you to unmute.
It looks like there's a huge support for the electrification process.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like a lot of the farmers are actually planning to use it for entertainment purposes. But the only main concern is that as long as it doesn't kind of impede like their ability to work on their farm or affect their daily lives, the public generally supports this project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much, Shelly, for that summary. Does anyone want to write anything else maybe in the chat about what are some other important points that they see? I think Shelly hit kind of like the really big important ones. People want refrigerators, yes. They want electricity, they don't care. They want lights, not the big machines around. That's exactly right. So I think that what this is trying to test is showing that you can summarize these different points. And again, I think people have done a really good job summarizing that the public in general has strong support, and in general, they want cheaper electricity. And these are kind of things that you might want to wrap into your proposal, where you would probably want to show to the World Bank, we did this survey, lots of people are supportive, and you would also probably factor in that cost is really important and try to get as much access as possible. Okay, so there's another part that I'm going to skip over. There's a little bit more math. Again, I encourage people to look at this offline. And so now we're at the conclusion. And so imagine that you have a meeting with the Drusel Electrification Initiative. So I like maybe might have time for one person, maybe two, to take a shot at presenting an electrification proposal. And to since we didn't go through all of the details of the case, why doesn't someone just talk about what they think would be a good electricity source to use and summarize the public comments, and maybe also talk about what more they would want to study before putting together the final proposal. So does anyone want to raise their hand, unmute, give that a shot? You can answer one, like all of those questions, or maybe one out of those 3 questions. Okay, I see 2 people. So why don't you guys kind of split it? I'll unmute first.
I could take the first part. I just like to summarize first, just to be clear with the objectives, that the goal of this is cost effectiveness and also to improve quality of life, so growing economy and quality of life. So looking at the fraction of funding that should be allocated to each energy source, we want to be as cost effective as possible. So I think that with wind being the most sustainable option and most optimizable on the outskirts, I think not a lot of, actually outskirts doesn't take up much of Drusselstein, so I would allocate first the smallest amount. I'd allocate 15% to wind. And then looking at the efficiency of coal, I would allocate around 75% to coal, and then the remaining percentage to wood if needed. Okay, first part.
All right, fantastic. All right, take it away, Vincent.
Thank you. Yeah. So to just to include as just for just like more part of the proposal, Timothy. Okay. Yeah. So to add on to that, add on to what Yichao said, further building upon our coal and solar, our coal and wind energy sources. We can have we dive more into the details of the risk, how we can have the various risks there and how we can mitigate it. Specifically, we've heard there's contention of how people don't want quote unquote big machines in the area. So we have to work with, as we put in our proposal to the World Bank, that we'll put these spots in like very strategic areas away from perhaps more urban, more developed areas to utilize the space better, and perhaps see how we can use that as better farmland to keep these sources of power used better and spaces better utilized.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. So I'll give kind of like a sample conclusion. These are some thoughts that I would make sure are in the conclusion. So first, we're asking the fraction of funding to allocate each source. So you definitely want to nail down actual percentiles. So I'll say maybe we want 60% to coal and 40% to wind. The reason that we settle on this fraction is because the citizens of Drusselstein are really concerned about having as wide access as possible, and coal will deliver this through its lower costs. And we're also going to add wind because it has fewer of the negative health concerns, and also that it is economically viable in some regions of the country. Based on the public comments, there's very strong support for the electrification initiative. And again, citizens are most concerned about when they can have access rather than the exact type of source, which is pushing our government towards choosing the most cost-effective ones. And so as for things that we might want to study more, is that we would probably want to study more about the cost of distribution and how to decide which areas to electrify first. And then we would also maybe consider a long-term plan of, in the short term, this is our electrification plan, but maybe we also should consider a longer-term multi-decade approach to electrification. And so this was a little bit abbreviated, but hopefully this gives a sense of how a case would go and this hopefully was good practice as well. Does anybody have some questions either about this case specifically or casing in general? Just kind of open time for questions now.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, James.
Yeah, so in this example, it was rolled out over like a couple different slides, and then we like talked about each one. In the actual interview, where they basically like give you like a packet, be like, okay, this is the problem, these are the points, here's the data, you've got like 30 minutes to figure this out and get back to us. Is that like more likely how it would go?
That's a good question. I know firms are starting to experiment with more different formats. Kind of the traditional form is close to what we did, where the information is delivered through this like back and forth between the candidate and the interviewer, and you kind of are like scoping out, asking, oh, do we have information on this? Do we have information on that? For one of my interviews, I actually had what you said, where they like gave me like 40 slides, put me in a room by myself for an hour, and like I figured out had to figure out a case and like write stuff down, and then I presented it to somebody. And I also know some firms are doing like online type cases where you have like short response, multiple choice and stuff like that. So there are more and more different types of cases being done with different formats. But the gist of it, I think the most common form is kind of what we did today. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Then Yisha.
Sorry, this might be annoying, but what framework would you use for this case? And also, like, would you use a framework?
That's a good question. I think this case doesn't lend itself as naturally to like one of the traditional frameworks. I know if you like crack open like a consultant book, they'll be like know these 6 frameworks and you'll ace the interview or whatever else. I think for this type of case, the kind of framework I would use if I would like go back to the beginning would be, I would try it and it'd be more like a brainstorming type where I would just like write down things to consider. And the reason for that is like this case is a little bit more structured, where the interviewer has like specific charts and specific graphs that like I'm just trying to like make sure you run through all of them. And so the framework here would probably be like, I want to, consider like these 3 big things. Maybe the 3 big things are like energy sources available, what the public cares about, and like health concerns or something like that, which might just be like exactly what the start of the case was. But I think I don't think this one is like very natural for like fitting a specific type of framework into it, if that makes sense.
All right, so it looks like we're just at time at the top of the hour. Rebecca and Tim, did either of you have any kind of closing remarks? If not, I can kind of wrap this up.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, thank you so much, Kevin, for having us. Thank you, everyone, for attending this and participating. As Tim said, we really appreciate people like participating, speaking up, especially because we know I don't want to say kind of scary, but especially because it's not always natural. So thank you, everyone, so much for being such an interactive audience. As I said in the chat, if we don't get to everyone's questions, Tim and I are always more than happy to connect with other people, chat with people later. So I put our LinkedIn's in the chat if anyone wants to reach out. We'll also send this deck out afterwards. So if in case you want to like review it or anything, feel free.
Yeah, thank you so much again for everyone for coming, and for Kevin for putting this together, and for hosting. Had a really great time. And yeah, definitely feel free to reach out to myself and Rebecca and ask on LinkedIn and follow up with any questions.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Tim and Rebecca, for coming out and speaking to all the folks on this call. Can we all just give a virtual round of applause to our awesome presenters tonight? All right, thank you. And just a quick note, I really hope that this workshop is giving you a kind of brief sense of what a consulting case looks like, and also more generally how to tackle case problems, how to think analytically and analyze the data that you're given in order to compile a a good answer. One thing I will note is that as you're going through a lot of case interviews and case questions, one thing that's really going to help you excel is getting those reps in. So just doing a lot of practice. And in that regard, one thing personally for me that was helpful was having a case buddy. So I went ahead and dropped in the Firstly community within the chat. We have a channel where you'll be able to kind of ask for help and reach out to other folks within the community. So I think that might be a good place for you to contact the other people who were involved in this workshop, as well as our broader consulting workshop series, and really find a casing buddy that way. So, with that said, thank you again, Tim and Rebecca, and thanks for everyone for joining this workshop. I'm looking forward to seeing you on Slack and staying connected.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.